Hello, everybody. Welcome to GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC. This week's show will be all about the London Classic, which had an entirely different character than when we left off last week. We are out a bit later this week due to my travels to and from the National Grade Championship in Orlando, but that gives me the chance to report the final results from the Classic. In a tournament where almost no one won more than one game, 5 players went winless and 4 went undefeated. Fabiano Caruana and Ian Nepomniachtchi paced the field with 6 out of 9. Caruana emerged victorious in the playoff to win the title. Now, for some time, it looked like Caruana was playing alone as he won not just the first game of the event in round 4 against Karyakin, but also the second game of the event in round 5. So let's take a look at that gradual attack which broke through against Vishy Anand. All right, we're going to see later how Anand had a tough tournament. But give Anand credit that he played with a good fighting character in these games, and he produced some of the more interesting chess, albeit on the losing side. All right, now knight c3. Okay, so we have the Berlin, white avoiding the Berlin ending, and what can he do? He can play c3, the Gioco Piano style, or take the knight, but Caruana does it a little bit differently by playing knight c3 first and waiting for black to castle, who's not necessarily forced, and now taking the knight. And what this means is that black has committed the king to the king side, so if white wants to play one of these lines where he castles queen side, then he knows that he has a target already for the attack, so that's how it goes. And Fabiano brings the knight over. And so white is heavily loaded on the king side. He's clearly going to have some opportunities for initiative there. However, he's going to be counterattacked. And so white playing an awful lot of moves on the king side. Of course, once that pawn gets to h5, the knight is a little bit cemented into f5 because g6 will mean an open h-file. And Caruana has delayed queenside castling for a bit, although I don't know if there's any way black could take advantage of it so much. He could play c4 here, which is playable, but doesn't lead to anything all that special. There are many very reasonable alternatives along the way for both sides, really, but nothing that moves the needle all that much. It actually is an even game for most of the way. All right, so now white finally castles. And black plays f6. You could argue about this move that maybe it presents a target for white to attack, although now black can extend that a2 g8 diagonal to try to set up a battery. c4. That move can maybe be slightly questioned, that it's not helping because white will be first to use the d file. And now we have some kind of breakthrough with white playing g5. All right, this is a very interesting moment in the game because Vishy probably should have played h6 to stop white from playing that move. And if the bishop goes back, black can play bishop f7. He can answer rook g3 with the king h8. He has pretty good defensive resources on the king side and can turn his attention to a counterattack in similar fashion to the way he did in the game, but probably a little bit better, safer version. Instead, he played bishop f7 right away, and white sacrificed his pawn on h6. But now the black king is rather more exposed. He can shield the g file by bringing rook or bishop to g6, but there are going to be also other avenues to the king that Caruana exploits. So white succeeds in blocking that a2 g8 diagonal to the king, although black is able to open the a file. Attacking the e4 pawn. Rook d1, b5. So black getting counterplay going. White could have played bishop b2 here. B takes c4. Now there's a very cool move, rook d8, which actually doesn't, well, it threatens, I guess, bishop e5. So black can play rook back to 8. It's not even necessary. Maybe queen b5. Keep that rook on the third rank. Defends both e8 and e5. And white might play something like queen c3, rook g6. Okay, white can get back the e5 pawn, but the position is probably about equal. So Caruana plays c5. One idea, trying to keep some pieces on the board. And now probably black should take on c5. Takes. Bishop takes h6, and now bishop back to f8. And this is where I try to give Anand a little credit, because he may have seen this and thought it was kind of drawish. You know, not necessarily that he was going to lose it, but that didn't have any winning chances, perhaps. So he kept the queens on the board with b4, bishop b2, and now bishop g6. And this turns out to be quite a big mistake. It's understandable that he wants to hit the knight, because white is getting ready to play f4. But after the move rook d5, hitting e5, it's actually breaking down sooner. And, you know, from here on, white has a very strong position. Queen b5, and the rook came back to g3 to guard the back. Back from g3 to guard the back rank. And black's position is already very dangerous, but c6, I think, made it worse. I don't really get the rationale of cutting the rook off on the third rank, but I think that Anand was really just pressed for moves here. Check, and now the bishop retreats. My Komodo says bishop b2 is even more winning. I'm not really sure why, but this seems very natural. King f7. And now a nice simple end to the game. Caruana just retreats knight to h4, and he has a big threat to take the bishop, followed by e5, and then the queen comes in. Black doesn't really have any counterattack, because if the queen goes to a5, all these squares, a1 and a2, are guarded. So basically the white queen is going to come in a couple of moves. Yeah, slightly fast or sudden resignation. I think that Anand does that sometimes, but white is totally crashing through with the attack. So that wasn't the game that broke the ice, because he'd already beaten Karyakin with black the round before. But at that point, after 5 rounds, Caruana was the only one to win the game, and he was in the lead by a point. Now he slowed down after that, and then he saw Nepom spring into action. First overcoming Adams in a long endgame in round 6, and Nepom started a string of 3 straight victories, which folded him into the lead. The second was the sharpest, with both players playing with spirit and abandon. The loser was, again, unfortunately, the hapless Anand. So that we will look at that one next. Okay, so now Nepom won 3 games in this tournament, and this was the one he won with white, and it was very, very different in nature to the other ones, because this one he went for an attack. Now, he plays e3, not d4, holds that back, and a6, well, seems to be with the idea of taking on c4 and following up with b5 to get a kind of Queen's Gambit accepted. But not surprising that Nepom would protect it with the pawn, because the e3 kind of signals an intention to play that type of position anyway. So with a6, we lead into positions that are very, very similar to known ones, but generally we see this more with a black pawn on c6 than a pawn on a6. So the move that Nepom plays now G4. I like the spirit of it, but it's a little bit less of a bold move than it might seem if you don't know this opening. Here in this particular position, it's a novelty, but with the pawn on c6, that type of position, it's a very common idea, often played as sacrifice. Usually white gets the queen to c2 first to create some extra pressure on h7. But it's a typical type of idea these days in modern chess. Grandmasters love to throw the kingside pawns forward. So Vishy, he doesn't have to take it, but he accepts the challenge. Rook g1. And now if he goes back, white can take back on d5. And black is advised not to take because knight takes d5. And now taking the knight would really be a disaster. Rook g7, king h8. Rook f7 is winning. Or knight g5 is even a bigger disaster as mate is coming. But Vishy's idea is first support the knight, and now block the diagonal with e5. So black, these two pawns, this pawn duo is covering a lot of nice squares in the center, and although the knight can be chased back, still the pressure on g7 is not that great, and the long diagonal is pretty well blocked for now. Now along here, there are many alternatives. Queen f3, h6, knight e6, and then there's one computer suggestion of rook g8 with the idea of answering queen f5 by undermining c6, the undermining move c6, and then f4, and then it's crazy complicated. It's just another bold computer line. I don't know what AlphaZero would have to say about that, but human being is going to take the knight. But a reasonable alternative here is to play knight c6, queen f5, and g6, chase away the queen and take the pawn on e6. And then the queen side structure is intact, but I think this other part of the board is probably a little bit more relevant, so understandable that Anand gives up the b7 pawn. Bishop to c4. Now I think this is a moment where it's possible to take the pawn on a6, because knight c5 can be answered by queen g2, threatening mate, and then the bishop can come back. But black could probably play more strongly with something like e4, and now knight c5 is a bigger threat. So I think that Nepom really, he did not want to give that tempo, and also maybe he's not so sure he wants to take the pawn on e6 because there could be some chances queen might get trapped after e4. So it's one of those moves where the computer says you can do it, but from a human standpoint, more natural to play bishop c4 and get the queen out of there. Black is looking to push a4. White stops it for now. So black has to be a little bit wary of this long diagonal, obviously. But he doesn't want to trade queens so much, because even though obviously he wouldn't get attacked like in the game, because white has a probably sounder pawn structure, and the bishop pair in an end game he can really play with no worries. But in the middle game, black does have some space with those pawns in the middle. Rook d1. So it's a fairly even position. But this move e4 is probably a little bit of a miscalculation. Definitely a bold move to open the long diagonal. Black wants to get into bishop e5. Black can play any number of moves, but I don't know if he has an obvious move that prepares e4. Something like queen g7 he can play, but then the e5 square would not be defended. So Vishy is looking to get in bishop e5, but the timing doesn't work out so well for him because white has a very nice resource here, knight f4. He leaves the bishop hanging on b5. Now if black takes it, knight g6, black has to take with the rook, and I think rook g8 here is forced. Now white can't take the knight because of mate, but just trades, and queen e6. And as the material goes down, the rook can be stronger against two knights, as it can get go on open files. Two knights, don't control. They're both short-range pieces. So, white probably would play d3 and open up the rook, and it seems to be better for white. All right, so Vishy went the other way, g5, but in both cases, white is better. Rook g8, queen h6, and now he should have thrown in rook g1 to force the bishop back to f1, and nothing amazing happens, but white's advantage is probably a little bit lessened. He went rook g7 right away, and then the bishop went to c4. And now white is in really good shape. That open b file might help. Maybe the rook will come to b1, or white can open up the center, and black is just a little bit too tied down to do anything effective. For instance, if king g8, white can just play king e2, and getting out of the way of rook g1, and then he's thinking about freeing his rook. All right, so in the game, he played queen b2, I guess partly to try to keep the rook off of b1, king e2, a4, of course the knight on f6 he's got to stay with. Now knight e6, rook f7. Nepomuk gave himself the option of this maneuver, knight d8. I think rook g7 is forced. And now there's some interesting stuff going on in the position, because, all right, first of all, white can play rook g1, a very cool move, because of takes, queen f8 check, and either piece comes to g8, knight f7 is kind of smothered mate. But after rook g1, black can actually play knight g4, and if fg, queen c2 actually keeps black in the game, because first of all, there are some perpetual ideas, and also queen getting to d3, there could be a hanging knight. So when white, makes a defensive move and black can get the piece back, white still is much better, but not game over. According to the engine, better than rook g1 is actually a3, which is along the lines of what Nepomuk did in the game, because the black queen is very limited on account of having to stay with the knight. It's all, almost a zugzwang. And he did something similar in the game, but I think in a little bit more human way, because he played in this position with the knight and f4, where it guards more squares, like d3. And after a3, now the computer liked the other line better, because black could play queen b6 and limit it to a plus over minus situation, but white still well on top. The move that Vishy played, knight e8, was answered by queen c6, attacking the knight, also hitting the pawn in a4, and black would be dropping another pawn, so Anand resigned. So a very interesting, curious game. White building for that attack, but of course playing with the king in the center, and really it was perhaps a closer game than it seems, because white ended up winning pretty smoothly, but I think it really hinged on that knight e2 move, which Vishy must have overlooked. So Nepomuk won that game, and then next up was Magnus Carlsen, and that was the critical game in round 8. Carlsen was out of sorts, suffering from a cold, and his condition, I would say, definitely played a role, as Nepomuk was able to counterpunch to victory. We'll see that one next. Now, Carlsen was playing some strange openings here. I think maybe that happens when he's just not feeling his best. He maybe does it to kind of get his juices going. He played f4 in this tournament. He actually beat Adams with that move. And in this game, he plays knight f3, which is normal enough, but he plays c3 here. Really, what I say about that move is it just kind of says, okay, I want to play a Slav exchange variation, because it can kind of obviously lead to this. And now Nepomuk chases the bishop away and comes back. So he gives a tempo, but the bishop goes to d2, where it's not incredibly active. So take advantage of the move in symmetry. He plays e4. And I'm not going to focus that much on these opening moves. There are obviously different things that could have happened from move to move. All kinds of standard stuff. Okay, Carlsen gives the bishop for the knight, but he does also get to bring his queen into better attacking position. And after bishop to b4, we have a very interesting moment in the game, because Carlsen could have taken this pawn on h6. Now, if pawn takes knight e4, the knight is stuck there because of queen f7 and knight g6 mate. And if bishop e7, white is really in a situation for winning attack. Rook e3 is apparently winning, but d5 is even more direct. And if e d5, rook d5, and crashes through the center. Note that very often these isolated queen pawn positions, like white sticks the rook in the middle, and they don't seem to be really doing anything all that much. But then suddenly something happens, the center gets blown open, and you understand. So after bishop takes h6, probably black is forced to capture the knight to make sure that doesn't jump in. But now the bishop is not available for defense. Bishop g7 is an option, but black could play bishop a4, rook h8. It's turns out to be probably not as clear as just recapturing right away. Takes. And now in this position, I think queen g3 check. And this is not winning for white, but in the old variations, black runs into trouble. The closest one might be this one, knight f7, but now white comes back for a fork. He can take the rook on c8. Now if queen g6, after knight to d6, or maybe it's even slightly more accurate to check first. As because king g7, knight e5 can be good, so king g8. Queen g6 check, king f8, and now knight d6. Somewhat more unusual situation. If you take the knight, I can take on f6 and lift a rook. Queen g7, and now probably white should keep the queens on. Bishop c6 and f3. All right, not all trivial analysis, and even now not completely decisive. But white's going to take that rook and have a rook for two minor pieces and a couple of pawns, but black has some trouble organizing. So it was probably a good try, and for whatever reason he didn't do it. I'm sure he saw it as a possibility, maybe felt he couldn't calculate it, it just didn't feel in the mood, so he played rook e3. But his opportunity for attack slowly disappears, and probably here he maybe should not have allowed that bishop to come over. Now basically that dissipates his attack. And he tried c4, which black probably could have and should have taken the pawn on d4, but he played knight d7, and here Carlsen probably should play c5, and maybe it's advantage, maybe it's a drawish position, but he just really started to go off the rails here, played knight c6, and took the knight away from the action, take this pawn, but he's not able to hold on to it. Black plays knight b6, attacking the pawn. And around here, Magnus really has to make a draw, maybe bishop e5, just give back the pawn, get bishop opposite colors. But I just wasn't seeing it. And that's the thing about Magnus, especially when he's a little bit out of sorts. He can very easily lose a game by pressing too hard because his will to win is really enormous. Rook takes c5, and even here, bishop e5 is stronger. And okay, he needs to take the knight here. If he takes the knight, He's a pawn down. It's an ugly position, but maybe he could draw it. But okay, I guess you'd have to say his whole idea was queen c6, but he just whiffed on queen a4. Just missed that move. I thought he was going to take the knight back, but now the queen is attacking the bishop on f4. So it's just winning for black, and he played a couple of more moves. Black just blocks the c pawn. Eventually, he's going to surround it, take it off, and so Carlsen resigned. So, not what you're used to expecting from Carlsen, but he was obviously very off his game. Now, Carlsen bounced back with a win over Aronian in the last round, if you can call it bouncing back, because it seemed that Aronian controlled most of the game. He sacrificed a piece, probably unnecessarily. He just had a much better game, and then he followed it up poorly, and Carlsen eventually won. So Aronian absorbed his first loss against 0 wins, not much of a tournament for him, while Carlsen moved up to a tie for third with Vache Lagrave and Wesley So. He also took first in the final overall standings in the Grand Chess Tour. Meanwhile, Hikaru Nakamura, whose play I touted in the first 3 rounds, ended up drawing every game. So much for this early fighting play. It led to nothing. All right, so Nepom put the pressure on Caruana, who responded by defeating poor Mickey Adams, who combined with Anand for more than half of the losses in London. And if you throw in Karyakin, who lost 2, that's almost all the losses in London. That set the stage for the playoff, and the decisive blow was landed in the 4th game, and we'll see that one next. All right, I'm not going to focus on the opening too much. It was a Moscow variation, or bishop b5 check Sicilian. a4, okay, a little bit out of the ordinary, but fundamentally known position. And this is, I guess, pawn sacrifice, which Nepom thought better of taking. I don't know if he knows the theory on it, but maybe in a rapid game, best to not force yourself to make a lot of defensive moves early. So there was a lot of maneuvering, and eventually Caruana grabs pawn. I mean, sort of a sacrifice, I guess, but looks like white is consolidating, and then at some point, Nepom gets some compensation. This bishop gets in. So around here, black is probably okay, but he doesn't make the most of it. I guess in h5 to keep the knight out of g5. I'm not sure that was such a great move. Black could have considered playing f6 at some point, maybe now, but he just trades. The queen's on the same file as the rook, but black can't exploit it. And knight d3, black can't get the pawn back like this because then his d5 pawn hangs. So he plays bishop f8. He decides to maneuver this knight g7 f5, which is not so wonderful because white gets an e6, and Caruana now develops a winning position. Possibly he should have delayed that capture, because when he plays knight d7, his knight is now not defended, so black could try knight b4, maybe is the best move, or knight d4, which is what he did. But this does run into knight e5 check. And now if black doesn't want white simply to take g6 with the queen for nothing, he's got to fly off into the wild blue yonder. And this is not such a difficult sacrifice to make, because after rook e1, black has to throw the knight in the way. So, by the way, this is our first example of check, but not our last, just like in the movies. And so now, clearly black is in trouble with that king running around, and white has some opportunities, but it's not always easy to find the right moves in a fast game. So after after e5, queen g3. That's a good move. e4. And now the best move is actually king e1. It's a little unnatural to bring the king closer to the center. Caruana played it a more normal way by getting in the other direction, but it sets up a very quick threat of rook d2, and black doesn't really have any defense to white shifting the attack. He played instead queen check followed by king g1, which is very natural. He unpins by putting his king to a safe place, and just maintains long-term attacking chances. So black manages to equal the number of pawns, and hey, if it was a rook ending, he would be very, very happy. But the problem is that his king is under potential assault. And so first, Caruana grabs the H pawn. He's not really sure how to put him away, but it's one of those things where black can't really do much, and he's just got to keep making defensive moves. So Caruana makes a lot of moves. I imagine there was increment involved, so he's getting more time, and then he pushes h4. Sometimes when you push that past pawn one square, it demonstrates to the opponent like, okay, I'm going to just queen this pawn while you're doing nothing, and then they end up providing another opportunity somewhere else. So Nepomuk goes for counterplay with e3. Makes sense. Check. And now, okay, white could just take on e3, but he decides to go for this line. Check. Rook b6. He takes d5. And now in king c4, he puts everything on this long diagonal. So now if e2, there are many winning moves, but I don't know. I think my favorite one might be rook b5 check, just for aesthetic reasons, and white will eventually pick up this queen and not allow black to queen. So Nepomuk took on f2, king takes. Now it's not really much to suggest for black. Of course, now white has two passed pawns on the king side, so any simple trade, like a trade of queens, especially, will be easy for white. Black can't even try to trade rooks with rook f6 because he gets skewered and ends up down a queen. He would lose that queen ending anyway. But here, after king f2, he tries queen b2 check, and that is answered by rook d2 check, and there goes the queen, and with it the title to Caruana. So entertaining last game, obviously very difficult to play. Do those last several moves without a whole lot of time to think. All right, so there was certainly some consternation after the first 15 games produced no winners or losers, and 10 decisive games in 9 rounds is a low total. But the last 3 rounds produced 7 decisive games, and you can't complain about a finish like that. I think the averages suggest that 2 out of 5 games would be decisive per round in a 10-player tournament. But it's normal that the wins and losses are not always evenly distributed in each of the rounds. That's just how it goes. Like if you flip a coin 100 times, it might come up heads 6 times in a row, but it still is likely to be eventually around 50-50. Certainly in the long haul. So hopefully we've staved off the panic about draws, destroying chess, at least until the next time. All right. Next week, I'll tell you how the Russian Superfinal turned out. I'll probably have some thoughts about AlphaZero's stunning victory over Stockfish in an unofficial match. If you haven't heard, AlphaZero is a self-taught program. They gave it the rules of chess, and they just set it to work playing against itself, and supposedly after 4 hours, it was ready to take on Stockfish. But they decided, the time control and the version of Stockfish playing. So I'm still processing this all, and I'd like to take a closer look at the games too. Maybe we'll look at them a little bit together. That's for next week. Anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed the show this week. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin, and I hope you will join me next time for GM Joel's Chess Week Recap. on ICC. Happy Hanukkah.